That's what an alliance is based on, a common interest. And the Indians, the Russians, and the Chinese do not have a common interest except really hating the United States at this point. That does not make a foreign policy. The economic reality, the military reality, these are the things that make it. And frankly, as Chinese are basically tilted to exports heavily rather than imports, they're not a market that China can get to, that India can get to, I should say. For the Indians, access to the American market is critical. They can't afford to break with the United States. China is not going to be buying their goods. So how does it continue growing as quickly as it is? So what I'm trying to say is that gestures is gestures. They're worth every penny you spend on them, nothing. And now the parade's over, everybody going home, and the only deal that was made was one with the Russians and the Chinese in terms of developing a pipeline. On the other hand, it ain't going to be ready for a whole lot of years. So nothing came out of it in that sense.
I mean, speaking of gestures, it's quite interesting. I want to look at this parade in Tiananmen Square with China, Russia, and North Korea, the three leaders there. I mean, obviously, it is in many ways a gesture, but then obviously, often in some ways, you can in international politics sort of read into legitimately who's at an event, who's not, where are they sitting, who says what. You know, I think Xi said in his speech something about Taiwan, whereas 10 years ago when he did a speech at the same event, he said nothing about Taiwan because relations were good at that point. Just from a general perspective, how can you read into that sort of thing? What do you look for when you're saying, oh, these gestures matter, but these ones don't?
I look at what they're capable of doing, not what they intend to do or would like to do. In other words, you can sit, have talks, and everything else, all right? And you can have tensions with countries like the U.S. had tensions with the Europeans. But in the end, Europe had to have a relationship with the United States. The United States had to have a non-dangerous relationship with Europe. So you always have to think, as in a business deal, when two sides sit down and say, talk about a merger or talk about some sort of deal, the money's got to be there. The power's got to be there in the case of states, but the money as well as military and so on. So you can be very polite, you can show all sorts of closeness and everything else, but in the end, what's the deal? And when you can't find a deal in private business, you can play golf with the guy every weekend. It doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to pull off the merger. And so it's very important, and one of the bases of our methodology here is to disregard gestures, disregard anger, disregard love, disregard all the passions. In the same way as in business, you put these aside and you don't say, oh, these two guys got together in Vienna or something and say, oh, this is happening. You take a look at their needs, their imperatives, their capabilities, their limits, and so on. And that defines them. So you cannot decide you're just going to fly just because you have parakeets. You just can't do that. The gestures are intended for consumption. It's like raising in a poker game. You can't raise too much because they might call you. And that's a reality.
I mean, let's look at this trio, Russia, North Korea, China. From a strategic and military perspective, what do you make of it?
Well, it shows one thing. Russia had only one ally in this war. It was North Korea. That's pretty sad for the former Soviet Union. Okay? That they were invited to this thing, the Russians probably said, yeah, I'm going to let them show off. Okay? So it's a minor power. When you take a look at what the Russians want, is they really wanted the Chinese, if not to send troops and engage, at least provide aid. They provided things they could sell. They didn't go out on a limb. So in each country, what they wanted to do was show the world they're not afraid of the United States. When I was a kid hanging out in the Bronx, I wanted to show that I really was tough and not afraid of the gangs around there. The fact was they'd kill me if they wanted to, and I didn't have any choice. So there is gestures in politics, and it's not unimportant. But ultimately, you have to sit down and look at power, economic, military, and other sorts, and then see if a merger is possible. And remember that even under communism, the Russians and the Chinese fought border wars. Long before communism, the Russians stole part of eastern China. Vladivostok is part of that. The Chinese want it back. The Indians and the Chinese were killing each other a year ago on the battlefield. So there is a need to demonstrate solidarity, but an inability to be solid.